So hi everyone. Good morning or afternoon, evening, wherever you are. I'm really happy to actually be kicking off this conference. I'm sure for all of us, it's a welcome break from all the current, I guess, apocalypse is what I like to call it, that's kind of going on. So like I said, my name is Ire, and I'm here to talk to you about the seemingly crazy world of performance metrics. So let's see. So when I was writing this talk a few months ago, before the apocalypse, I was going to give this whole spiel about how in countries like Nigeria, where I'm from, the cost of mobile data is pretty high relative to minimum wage. So it's about 3% for just 1 GB of data. And that's more than 1 full hour of work, which is pretty crazy. And even in countries like the US, where the minimum wage is higher, the cost of data is also higher. So minimum wage employees have to work almost 2 hours just to earn enough to get 1 GB of data. And I don't know about you, but I can definitely use 1 GB in I don't know, an hour or a day if I'm not connected to Wi-Fi. So that just seems kind of crazy to me that it will cost so much. And I was going to discuss how even if you're not building for users that are data conscious out of necessity, having a more performant website is always just going to be like a competitive advantage. And that's why in almost all the popular websites and applications, they're investing heavily in providing light and performant websites or having data saver modes within their mobile applications, because they know that being more performant and just using up less of people's data is just going to make them a better application, and more people will be more likely to use them. Because in this day and age, having a performant website is basically just like having good service, except your users are going to be a lot less patient. I mean, if you think about it, if you went to a restaurant and it was taking like a while before you got seated, you might wait maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And the thing is, the longer you wait, the more invested you get, because you don't want to have to go and start all over again in a different restaurant. So you have this really high switching cost. But on the web, it's completely different. Users are 90% more likely to abandon a page that takes just 5 seconds to load. And that's mainly because there's none of that switching cost. A user can be in the equivalent of 5 different restaurants at the same time, and they just go with whichever one happens to seat them first. But at this point, I think the biggest argument for why performance is important is just kind of looking at where we are right now. I mean, we're all supposed to be in sunny California enjoying like the conference in person. But in this health crisis that we're facing, everyone's working from home, leaning more and more on internet services. So having a performant website isn't really just like a nice to have anymore. It's just becoming more and more actually critical and important. So I already had this amazing intro, so I don't think I really need to go over all this stuff. I am currently in London, actually. Like, I was supposed to go back to Nigeria, but kind of got stuck here. So I feel like this should be part of everyone's bio. Like, where are you quarantined or on lockdown? And yeah, some other uninteresting information. So yeah, we know that having a performant website is important, but what does it actually mean to have a quote unquote performant website? So we all know that there's a time between when a user enters a URL into their browser and when the web page is fully loaded. So making a website more performant is ultimately going to be about reducing that time in between to basically as little as possible, or even like zero. Maybe one day we'll get there. And the only way we can reduce that time is by knowing what it is in the first place. And that's where performance metrics come in. So back in the day, measuring performance was as simple as taking the time before we get to the onload event, which was when the page and all its resources were fully loaded. And we do something like just take the dates at the top of the document. Then after the load event, we'll take the date again and then compare the 2 times. And if you wanted to be even more fine-tuned, like if you were like a real performance expert, you might use the DOM content loaded event to know when the DOM has been constructed. But a lot happens between these 2 events, and that's kind of what has given birth to the state of performance metrics today. We have a seemingly crazy amount of metrics that measure every bit of the process of loading the page, and it can definitely seem incredibly overwhelming to just have metric after metric all the time. And luckily, there are frameworks we can use to kind of better understand these metrics and what they're actually for. I really like these 4 questions that are adapted from the web.dev website, and they kind of just organize metrics based on what is the user experience they're actually trying to track. So first, the question is their content. And this is just about measuring if there's basically any response to the user after they've tried to navigate to the page. And the metrics that are relevant to this are time to first byte, first paint, first contentful paint. So time to first byte measures the time from when the browser requests the page to the first byte of the page being received. And this is really useful for measuring the round trip between the user's device and the server. So it's not really a user-centric metric because even at time to first byte, the user doesn't get any feedback yet, but it can be really useful to know if this particular round trip is the bottleneck to other metrics. So first paint measures the time when the first pixel is painted on the screen. And this can be any pixel, and it's usually something like background image or background color. And it's really just a measure of, okay, when does the user stop seeing just a blank white screen, and just gives them some feedback that, yeah, the website actually exists or something is actually happening. Then first contentful paint. It measures the time when the first piece of content from the DOM is rendered. And this can be anything from text, image, etc., but it will usually be text since images generally take a bit longer to load. So next, the question is the content meaningful? So we have some content on the page, but is it the content that the user actually wants to see? So when do they actually start to see something that's relevant to them? So largest contentful paint. This is all about which piece of content is actually being loaded. So it measures the time when the largest piece of content within the viewport has been rendered. And it's kind of an approximation to the question, okay, when has the most important or most significant piece of content been loaded? Because obviously it's very useful with first contentful paint. We know that, okay, some content has been rendered, but we might want to know specifically if a specific important piece of content has been rendered. And that's what we can achieve with the largest contentful paint. And just as an aside, largest contentful paint is actually a successor to first meaningful paint, which has been used for a really long time. And they're very similar, but they just have a few differences which are mainly related to implementation. So for example, first meaningful paint took into account things like content within iframes, whereas largest contentful paint doesn't. And there were also some implementation details with the browsers, which meant it couldn't be standardized across many different browsers. So that's why largest contentful paint was created. So generally speaking, they're doing the same thing, and where you might see someone trying to record first meaningful paint, you can just substitute that for largest contentful paint. So next we have visually complete, and this measures the time taken for the content within the viewport to be fully rendered. And this is just a good metric to know when does the user perceive 100% completeness, because even though it's just content within the viewport, as long as it's all the user can see, then that's when they perceive that, oh, okay, everything has actually been loaded, even if it hasn't. And then we have speed index, and this uses the visually complete metric and assigns a score based on the progression to visually complete. So it's not just the time taken to get to visually complete, but it looks at how the progression looks to the user. So this can be a key difference for things like single page applications, where the user might just see a blank screen for like 3 seconds, and then at 4 seconds, everything appears, versus something that's built with maybe like the Jamstack, where it might have more of a progression. So it's also like useful to know for that kind of thing. And even in tools like Lighthouse, the speed index score you're assigned is also based on the speed indices of other real websites. So I think it's just a generally useful metric to be aware of. So the next question is the content interactable? So yeah, we've gotten to the point where there's content on the screen, but can the user actually start to interact with it? So what happens if they try and press a button while things are still going on in the background and the page might not actually be able to respond? So first input delay measures the delay between the time a user can attempt to interact with a part of the site and the time that the interface is actually able to respond to that interaction. And this is really important because generally if users think that if they can see an interactive element like a button or a form or something like that, they think that that means they can actually immediately start interacting with it. But as we know, that's not always the case, because if there are long-running JavaScript tasks using up the main thread, for example, there might be a delay between when the user clicks that button and when you actually respond to it. And a really good measure of first input delay is what is called the max potential first input delay, which is like the biggest mouthful ever. It kind of takes a while to know what you're saying, but max potential first input delay, it measures the maximum possible first input delay, and it's based on the duration of the longest task. And this is a bit of an easier metric to track than first input delay directly, because it isn't just based on user interaction. It's just kind of figuring out, okay, what's the worst case scenario and measuring that specifically. And then we have total blocking time, which measures the total duration of JavaScript tasks between first contentful paint and time to interactive, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And this just kind of gives us an idea of how long a user could potentially be waiting if there are several blocking tasks. So to compare to the max potential first input delay, that's kind of looking at what the longest task is, but total blocking time gives us an idea of all the blocking tasks. And then finally, time to interactive. And this measures the time when the main thread has had up to 5 seconds with no network activity or JavaScript tasks. And the reason why having up to 5 seconds clear is important is because that's when the main thread is free enough to reliably respond to user input. So it's a good metric to keep track of, to know that, okay, at this point, we're good, essentially. So the last question is, are the interactions smooth? And this is about measuring the experience of the interactions and how enjoyable and pleasant it is to use. So first, cumulative layout shift measures the shifts in layouts while a page is loading. And there's potential for cumulative layout shift anytime between when the first content is painted on the screen and when the entire content has been painted. And this video from web.dev does a really good job of illustrating the problem with cumulative layout shift. So a user might be in the middle of trying to take an action like go back, or maybe trying to place an order, and a shift in layout might completely alter what they intended to do, and it can have pretty bad and negative consequences, like in this example where maybe they just actually lost money, and maybe they can get a refund, but that's like a whole process. Finally, frame rate is about the responsiveness and the smoothness of frame refreshes on the page. So for example, if you're scrolling down a page, does it seem janky? Or if there are animations on the page, does it look smooth, or is it just kind of things going on everywhere? And this game created by Jake Archibald really illustrates what slow animations look like. So the top aircrafts are the smooth ones and the bottom ones are the janky ones. So it just kind of illustrates what you should be aiming for and what a problematic animation would look like. So these are all the metrics together. And now you may be thinking, okay, so yes, I understand what each of these things mean, but that doesn't really help because there's still like a million different things and it's still incredibly overwhelming. But if we revisit the question, okay, what does performant actually mean for your site? We can see that performant isn't necessarily going to be the same for every site because it's specific. What does it mean for your particular site? And different sites can focus on different things, which means you don't actually need to worry about absolutely everything all at once. So let's take, for example, a news website, a fictional news website. So again, the first question is their content. So for me, I would probably pick first contentful paint to be the first thing to measure, because I think it's the most user-centric of the metrics, these other metrics anyway. And I think users care the most about when they see content on the screen, not necessarily about when they see like a background image or something like that. And they're going to be more likely to wait for more content to load if there already is content, rather than wait for that first bit of content to load. So next is the content meaningful. So I think largest contentful paint would be really important to find out when the most significant piece of content is loaded. And what's really great about this particular metric is that it doesn't necessarily have to be largest. It can be customized to target a specific element. So you could say largest contentful paint for me kind of means when does the headline show? And that might not be the largest, but it's the most significant piece of content to you. And like I mentioned before, speed index is also always a good metric to be aware of, because again, it's very user-centric. And if you use tools like Lighthouse, it also helps you compare what your website is like to others on the web. So next is the content interactable. So now for a news website that has more passive engagement, I think this is a bit less important than metrics like, I don't know, largest contentful paint, for example, because people aren't really using the website like Twitter, for example, where you probably want to know that there is no blocking time between when a user sees the tweet box and when they can actually just start tweeting. So for a case like this, where I think that the site is not as interactive as others, I would probably pick something like time to interactive, because this inherently encompasses all the other metrics, i.e. you're not going to have a smaller time to interactive number than your total blocking time. And then I think if you then see a problem with your time to interactive, then you can dive deeper and look into some of these other metrics. So finally, are the interactions smooth? And I think the most important metric here is definitely going to be cumulative layout shift, because there's kind of nothing more annoying than trying to read an article, something like important, something that might be really long, and then having the page jump around because there's like an ad or an image or something loading. So this is going to be really important to maintain the integrity of how a user is going to read the article, to make sure that this is going to be as low as possible. So now we're in a much better state. We've picked the most important metrics for us. We're really happy now. Everything is great. And the thing is, as you measure more, you can obviously add more metrics. This is not to say that you will never need to use any of the other ones, but I think just having a few ones to start with and then build on is what would make the most sense. So now you might be thinking, okay, so I know what metrics to use, but like knowing the metrics doesn't do anything, right? You need to know how to implement them and use them. So first, we've chosen our metrics, and the next thing we're going to need to do is define what's called a performance budget. And this just defines specific values to your metrics that your site should never exceed. So going back to our example, you might have something like first contentful page should not exceed 1.5 seconds, or largest contentful page should not exceed 2 seconds, or speed index should not exceed 0.43, and all of that. And so where do you get these specific numbers from? And where I would really suggest you start is sites like web.dev, because they give you a really in-depth view about each metric and what it does, but they also provide guidance on what a sensible value to aim for is. Also, sites like the Performance Budget Calculator, they provide really nice, sensible defaults for any website to adopt essentially. But another great tip is to kind of look at what your competitors are doing and where they are. So while those previous sites might help you know what a good general guidance is, it might be a completely different story when you dive into your particular industry. So it's always good to kind of look at where your competitors are and aim higher, essentially. Because the thing is, you don't necessarily need to have the fastest website on the planet. Like, you don't need to reduce that time to 0. You just need to make sure that you're, doing well compared to other people or whoever is like next to you. So you've defined your budget. How do you start measuring? This is pretty simple. I would suggest these two tools, Lighthouse and Calibrate, which allow you to choose the particular metrics that you want to use and integrate them into their testing tools. So you can say, okay, I want this to be this, and then they can give you specific feedback on how you're doing with those particular metrics. So that's it. You can now identify where your problems are, and you can iterate your site as you see fit, and you can keep track of how your site is doing on each of those metrics as you go along, and you can see how specific changes that you make, whether they're improving or having the opposite effect on particular metrics. So thank you very much.